Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first installment of the Economic Society's YouTube lecture series. We're very excited to have with us Professor Ben Baldanza, who graciously accepted to take the risk of being the pioneer of this little series. We're very excited about that. And tonight he's going to be talking to us about the future of the airline industry, especially with respect to COVID-19's impact on that. Perfect salient topic for everyone stuck at home. Very current events based. Before we get started, I'll introduce our guest. Like I was telling Professor Baldanza before, he's a man of many hats, but I picked what I think would be the most relevant for tonight's talk. So Professor Baldanza, he's had a long career in the airline industry that culminated with his 11-year tenure as a CEO of Spirit Airlines, where he transformed the carrier into what's known as an ultra low-cost carrier. He also co-hosts the Airlines Confidential podcast. He holds degrees in economics from both Syracuse and Princeton, and most notably, I'm sure he's most proud of this, is he is an economics professor here at George Mason. So without further ado, Professor Baldanza.
Thank you very much, James, and thanks to all of you who joined in for this event. We'll try to make it as interactive as possible. If you have questions, you can put them up on the site. James will read them to me, and we can go through. I'm sure all of you have flown on airlines. I'm sure all of you have thought about airlines. The class I teach, James took the class. The class that I teach is called Airline Economics, and it's a very applied course that is meant to teach the students the way airlines make decisions around a whole bunch of things, including how they price the product, how they schedule their airplanes, decide where to fly, do labor contracts, partnerships, frequent flyer programs, all kinds of things. So we try to have a good time in the class and try to make it fun. The industry isn't that fun now, so let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll go from there. So can you all see the screen now? Except it says questions. Let's see, I gotta get back here. Can you see that or not?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, yeah, so we will be talking about the future of the airline industry here. And again, as I go through this, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt and we can go through. The first quick answer is there is a future for the airline industry. So if it's a question of the future, there is. I wanted to start with this quote from Charles Darwin, which I think is really appropriate for the airline industry right now. It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent. It's the one most adaptable to change. And while he didn't write that thinking about airlines, that's clearly applicable to airlines right now. So if you think about the last 20 years, oil prices, which are a very large input cost to airlines, got as highly priced as $147 a barrel back in 2008. That was a huge shock to the airline industry. There was the financial crisis at the end of the 2000s that really put a crimp on being able to finance expensive airplanes and also reduce the number of people who travel for business. There were the 9/11 attacks in 2001 that where airplanes were used as a weapon, and people were really scared to get on airplanes for many, many months after that. And it changed a lot of things in the industry, including security. There's been fast changing technology, not only social media, which has changed customer service in the industry, but also in the airplanes themselves, making them more sustainable, burning less fuel and things. And all of these things have been big changes that the industry's had to adapt to, and it's found ways to adapt. That doesn't mean that every carrier that exists today is going to exist 5 years from now, but will there be an industry? I think there absolutely will be an industry. And that's because the world economy needs airlines. So let's talk about just a couple of numbers. The world economy has 29 million jobs associated with airlines. So if you think about this industry going away, almost 30 million people. I mean, there are many countries without that many people, right? And so it's a lot of jobs. It represents directly 3% of global GDP. There have been some studies that says it's indirectly responsible for almost 8% of global GDP. If you think about all the things that support the industry as well. Airplanes carry 40% of all interregional goods You know, if they're not going by train or boat, they're going, or truck, they're going by plane. But if interregional goods, 40% of that flies on airplanes. So the movement of goods is really important, needs airplanes. It's critical for developing nations. It's the way Africa, many parts of Asia, many parts of Latin America get a lot of what they get comes in on airplanes. Certainly places that are more isolated, like an Iceland or island places, need airplanes to get them lots of things. And 70% of all businesses, when you survey them, say that air service is essential to their business, either because they send their people out on trips to generate revenue or to see or to prospect business, or they use airlines for the services they provide. So the reality is there's not going to be a full economic recovery in this country without airlines recovering, because airlines are a fundamental piece of the economy. So going into 2020, airlines were concerned pretty much about three big things. When is the 737 MAX going to come back? That's the plane that had 2 crashes. Boeing has gotten a lot of grief appropriately for, and the FAA has, for maybe certifying a plane that wasn't ready to be certified. But that was a plane that was selling very well before those 2 crashes. So everybody was thinking at the beginning of this year, is that plane coming back this year? What does that mean for capacity and such? They were thinking about sustainability and growth. So there was a growing movement, mostly in Europe, a little bit here in the US, around what people call flight shaming, or saying that maybe you shouldn't fly as much because you're hurting the environment. So the industry sort of pushing initiatives around being more sustainable, newer aircraft, lower fuel burn, greener sort of approaches to things, and what does that mean for growth in the industry? And then there was a big concern about growth of low-cost carriers, and what does that mean for the pricing environment, and can carriers who do more for customers, like an American United or Delta, that have worldwide networks and partnerships and things, that can they compete with in a fair environment that is highly competitive? And these were the sort of the major themes that the industry was thinking about coming into this year. And if we had had this talk at the beginning of the year, I'd say you're going to see lots of movement on all these things. Then the virus hit, of course, and it changed everybody's priority. So now let's talk about what the future thinks about. I think the demand recovery we have to talk about is every airline's talking about how they're going to bring back capacity. But industry profits are closely tied to capacity. One of the things we talk about in my class is that airlines have very high average costs. Airplanes are expensive. Fuel is expensive. People are expensive. Airports are expensive. But they have very low marginal costs. And as economic students, you know what I mean by average versus marginal cost. And they're low marginal costs because a plane leaving in a few hours from now with empty seats, the cost for that airline to put someone in that seat is literally single-digit dollars. They will burn a tiny bit more fuel because the plane will be a little bit heavier if somebody's sitting there. They may or may not give them a glass of water or Coca-Cola. Even that's less common today, to give it to you free, right? So the point is, it costs almost nothing. The marginal cost is almost nothing. So industry profits have been tied to capacity. When capacity in the industry is greater than demand, prices tend to drop. And that's great for consumers, but it has put a lot of pressure on industry profits. If you look at 2017, that was a high watermark for industry profits. The US airlines made $15.5 billion that year. It's the most profit they've made in history in a single year. And what was so good about 2017 from an airline standpoint is that capacity and demand were pretty much in sync. The amount of capacity the industry was offering was closely aligned to the demand for air travel that existed in the United States. Over the next couple of years, after 2017, the industry grew faster than the economy. And what that did is it put pressure on fare, and the combination of airlines' costs going up a little bit and fare dropping, 2019 profits were under $5 billion. Now, that's still a profitable industry, but it's a 70% drop in profits from 2017 to 2019, mostly because of excess capacity. So when I read the paper and I read about the airline industry, I hear all these airline CEOs and other people talking about when is demand going to get back to 2019. And what I'm saying is you don't want demand back to 2019. You want it back to 2017. And if the industry's smaller today, which it is, as they build back, they should think about, to use a Joe Biden phrase, build back better, right? And build back to a better supply-demand equilibrium. So my guess for the recovery breakdown is you got to think about it in like a 2x2 matrix. I like 2x2 matrices. These can explain lots of things if you set them up right. So there's people travel for leisure reasons and they travel for business reasons. And they travel a short trip or a long trip. So haul is sort of an industry term, short haul, long haul. Short would be here to Boston, Washington to Boston. Long haul would be, really, be Washington to Europe or Asia or Latin America, but also a little bit Washington to the West Coast too. Those are 5-hour trips. That's a little bit longer too. So if you think about when we're likely to see robust demand back, I think we're going to see short haul leisure back next summer. And let me tell you why I think that. I think this summer has been a tough summer for families. Families drive leisure travel. And families have been home all summer. They've canceled lots of vacations. Kids have been doing school from home. And I think by next summer, the likelihood that there is some kind of a vaccine, even if it's not widely distributed yet, but I think after a year when everybody's been cloistered down, they're going to have almost sort of an equal and opposite reaction and say, we got to go somewhere. But they're not going to look at going to Europe, or they're not going to look at going to Hawaii. They're going to say, maybe we'll go to Florida. Or if they're in California, maybe they'll go to Phoenix or something like that, right? And go hiking in the mountains or do something like that. So I think summer 2021 has the chance to be pretty good for leisure. But I think it's going to be another year before long haul leisure comes back, before leisure travelers are willing to take those 5 to 14-hour kind of trips. I don't think people are going to be comfortable enough to do that yet next summer. I think that's going to be another year. If you look at businesses, it's going to take it's going to start sooner, but take longer to overall recover. The fall, the time period we're in right now, the September, October, November, December timeframe, the last 4 months of the year, tend to be very heavily business centric for airlines. If you think about it, in a normal year, kids are back in school, summer vacations are over with, and that's when businesses start sending people out to travel again. If you look at capacity right now, airlines are adding a little more capacity for October than they did for September. And they would only be doing that if they're seeing sales activity that's supporting that. So I think we're seeing a tiny little spark. I'm not going to suggest that it's strong. I'm not going to suggest it's robust. It's nothing as good as last year, nothing like that. But we're seeing a tiny little spark that this fall, businesses are starting to say, look, we need to get our people out on the road again. We need to go audit this plant that we haven't seen for 6 months. We need to go visit this customer who we haven't talked to other than on Zoom for 6 months, right? And so they're getting antsy about that. So in fall 2021, you're going to see a start to that short haul business return. But I think it's going to be spring 2023 before you see businesses, flying to Europe, flying to Asia with regularity. Today, the trips that are happening there are mostly essential workers, mostly people who have to go. It's still seen as way too high a risk right now. And I think it's going to be almost 2 more years from now, sort of spring 2023 or 2.5 years from now, before you see the long haul business trips. And if you think about airlines in this, like the short haul business and leisure, that's Southwest Airlines business. The long haul is the American United Delta business for a long sense. So what that suggests is that the higher cost airlines, the bigger airlines in the US, are going to have a longer recovery period, meaning that they're going to need to have more cash on the balance sheet right now. I also think it's likely that not all business travel is going to return. Businesses, it's important, businesses decide when to pay for business travel. Individuals travel for business, but usually their company pays the tab, buys the ticket for them. And they decide, yes, I'm willing to support you taking this trip. Now, obviously, the individual has to say they're comfortable taking the trip in a post-COVID world or through COVID world. But even if the person says, look, I'll go, the business has to say, we want to pay for that trip versus you just go ahead and have that meeting on Zoom. And what's going to happen is I think Zoom and Microsoft Teams and WebEx and name your favorite video platform, I think businesses are becoming really comfortable with that format. And it's going to replace some business travel, not all business travel. But I put this statement here, go to London for one meeting. A friend of mine who lives in New York and I were talking, and he said, Ben, you know, I used to go to London for a single meeting. He said, and I never thought of that as risky behavior. He said, I'm never going to do that again, vaccine or not. He said, I'll go to London for 3 or 4 meetings, but I'm not going to go just for one meeting. I'll just get on Microsoft Teams and do it that way. And if his attitude is is normal, and if other people think like him, then I think if you think about all the reasons people travel for business, there's some of those reasons that they will still want to travel. But there's some that they can say, you know, this aspect works almost as well through video and it saves us a ton of money. So let's go ahead and do that. In the United States, in the 48 states, this is actually going to affect Southwest the most because Southwest Airlines actually carries the most business travelers in the 48 states. And if you say, well, that's strange, I think of Southwest as a leisure carrier, but they're very attractive for business because they fly high frequency, meaning lots of trips in and among lots of big cities. And they're very easy to deal with. They don't charge bag fees. They don't charge change fees. They're very easy to transact with. And they have a lot of service and they're very reliable in and among lots of big cities. So they become a big flyer of business travel. Last week, one of the bigger pieces of news in the industry was that United Airlines said they're no longer going to charge change fees to most customers. That was quickly matched by American and Delta. And really, United's move was a direct response to Southwest. If you look where United is strong, Southwest is strong in almost all those places. And United saw themselves losing business to Southwest now when there isn't that much business, in part because Southwest didn't charge change fees and was easier to deal with. And United said, we're going to be like Southwest in that respect. And yet we can give our customers an upgrade to business class that Southwest can't. We can give them frequent flyer miles that let them get to Hawaii and Europe, which Southwest can't. We can give them a lounge in the airport, which Southwest doesn't. So United says, we have things that business travelers are going to like more, and we're going to take away the one thing they really didn't like about us was this change fee. So United went out and made a big splash about this. It's a big change for the industry, but it was really a direct reaction to Southwest and how big a business traveler airline they've become. So I've got a couple charts I want to go through, but I want to make sure if there's any questions now we can answer them before we go into it. Then I want to show you some data about what's really happening in the industry right now. All right, well, let's keep going then. So North American capacity is about halfway back. If you look at this chart, this shows by week of the year. And you can see it shows flights by week for the previous 2 months, for the last 2 months. And on the left side, the bars show the thousands of flights that are scheduled. And the line shows the week over week change in capacity. So you can see that there was a big drop in capacity in the week 28, 29 period, but then it's been relatively level in that. And you can see that it's the industry isn't growing much, but it's sort of stabilized. And if you look up here at the flight volume compared to 2019, the flight volume is exactly half of what it was last year at this same time. So the industry is putting about half the number of seats back. There's about 67,000 flights a day right now. That number in last year at this time would have been in the 140s to 150s maybe. Month over month, we're seeing a little bit more capacity. That's that comment I talked about airlines putting a little more capacity back. So this is what's happening in North America right now, is that that airlines are flying about that. And now let's look at sort of what this means by airport and airline. So these are five of the largest airports in the country: Atlanta, Charlotte, Denver, Dallas, and Chicago. And you can see the bars show the number of flights per week, and the line shows the percent of the total flights that they flew in 2019. So you can see that Charlotte, that Atlanta is flying, roughly 55 to 60% of the flights that they used to fly last year, and that's about 12 to 15,000 flights a day. Charlotte, a much smaller hub, is flying is flying only under 5,000 flights a day, but that's still about 60% of what they did last year. And so you can get a sense here as to for the biggest airports in the country, the airports that carry the most people and connect the most people, they're scheduling around this 50 to 60% time, operating about half the flights they used to. It's making flights more on time than they used to be, because there's just less pressure in the whole system. But there are still some delays for things. So those are airports. If you look at it by airline, you see airlines doing very different things. You see American being sort of American and Southwest sort of being the most aggressive, Southwest scheduling 75 to 80% of the flights that they flew last year. United only scheduling about 40% of the flights they flew last year. There's a couple of reasons for that. A lot of the flights United flies are long-haul international flights to Asia and Europe and Latin America. Southwest doesn't have any of those flights. So a lot of what United's not flying is what Southwest doesn't have. Delta's around 60% of their flights. And you can see in the bars how that's changed week over week. Delta got a little bit bigger and then has started to shrink a little bit. United's been relatively stable. American was being sort of most aggressive, but dropped in the last week a little bit. Alaska Airlines, a smaller airline based on the West Coast, they've been smaller. They're operating around 50%. There's a little airline based in Las Vegas called Allegiant. Some of you may have heard of Allegiant. Some of you have flown Allegiant. Allegiant's flying about 95% of what it flew last year. In part, that's because Allegiant, many places Allegiant flies, it's the only nonstop carrier. They tend to only fly a couple times a week between a small city and a big city. And they found that people still want to go to Florida when it's cold. People still want to go to Phoenix and go golfing. And people want to do that kind of stuff, even in the COVID world. And so they've been able to fly most of their schedule. But you can see airlines are taking sort of different approaches, with American and Southwest being more aggressive. And the reason is those two airlines are more domestic than Delta and United, who depend more on long-haul international business. That's what really explains the difference between American and Southwest versus Delta and United. So the last sort of chart I'll show you, and this is kind of an eye chart, you may not be able to read all this. The important thing is just to look at the top, and then there's a lot of detail on the bottom. If James, if you want these slides, I can send them to you at the end if any people want to see them. But Boston Consulting Group has just put out this study where they've outlined sort of 5 demand recovery scenarios for the industry, and then they've assigned a likelihood and a time frame to them. And what they think is most likely is this gradual recovery stretching into 2021, which they're calling sort of a prolonged U-shaped recovery. They say that's going to take 12 to 18 months, and it'll be sort of it'll be based on sort of consumer confidence that takes time to return, businesses maintaining strict policies, and so on. And if you think about this, this is not inconsistent with the 2x2 matrix I showed you earlier in terms of the time frame when I thought leisure and business would come back. They think a quick comeback, sort of a 3 to 6 month scenario, is a very low likelihood. that would require leisure and business traffic to bounce back quickly. There's no evidence that that's happening. It would also mean consumer confidence would have to recover quickly, and there's no evidence that that's happening either. So I agree with them that that's a low likelihood. And then these other cases, which are 6 to 9 months, 12 months, or sort of double dipping, they put those all at medium things. But I thought this was real interesting that they played around with different ideas. And in most cases, the sort of the far out time they have is 18 months of industry supply and demand sort of being a little bit back to normal. I think overall, this page is a little bit aggressive. I think it might take more than 18 months. If you think about it just in the domestic environment in the US, I think this is pretty accurate. But I think it's going to take longer than 18 months for some of the long haul things. So let me talk to you about a couple other changes that I expect as a result of COVID. I think you're going to see more narrow bodies ordered and fewer wide bodies. Let me talk about what I mean by that. A narrow body airplane is a single aisle plane that you've probably flown a bunch and haven't even thought about. A 737, an A320. Most of the flying that you do within the United States or within Europe or within Asia is on that kind of plane. Wide bodies are the bigger planes, the 777s, the 787, the A330, the A350, the 747, the A380. They're the really big planes that fly real long trips. They're what Emirates flies to Dubai from a bunch of places. They're what Singapore Airlines flies into the United States. They're what American United and Delta fly when they go really far. You need that size airplane to fly more than 6 hours, 5 or 6 hours. So any flights in the world that are long that use those wide bodies. The challenge is that wide body airplanes are step function more expensive than narrow body airplanes. And they're more expensive to buy and they're much more expensive to operate. They use a lot more fuel to get that heavy piece of equipment off the ground. And so what's happening is with demand sort of more speculative in terms of people taking really long trips, it's changing the order books of what airlines are thinking. They're thinking maybe we want some fewer wide bodies and a few more narrow bodies, and we'll focus more on sort of our 2 to 4 hour flight categories and a little less on the 14-hour kind of flight categories. I think there's going to be airlines that fail in Europe, Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And I'm not just this US centric guy who says the US is perfect. There's a reason that I don't have the US airlines on here. The reason that I don't have the US airlines on here is as a result of the high fuel prices in the late 2000s and the financial crisis, most of the US airlines went through bankruptcy processes. And in those bankruptcy processes, they fixed a lot of their structural issues. So coming into COVID, the US airline industry was actually a very well-structured industry. And that isn't true in Europe, Asia, Latin America, and Africa. They didn't go through what the US airlines did in terms of a restructuring 10 years ago. So COVID is now going to force them through that. And they are likely to use bankruptcy to manage fleet complexity. Let's look at Latin America, just south of us. Aeromexico, Avianca, the Colombian carrier, and LATAM, which is the carrier of Chile and has an airline in Brazil and Peru as well. Those three carriers are all in bankruptcy protection right now. Their business isn't more affected than the US, but they never went through that structuring. So they entered COVID a not well-structured industry. Wrong fleets, big retirement costs, wrong sort of growth trajectories. So I think you're going to see failures of airlines, and you've already seen some airlines fail in Europe and Asia. But in Latin America and Africa, I think that's coming as well. I think you'll see the use of bankruptcy more. And like every big challenge that has affected the industry, I think what follows this is going to be another smaller wave of consolidation. In the US airline industry today, we have 4 huge carriers, American, United, Delta, and Southwest. Collectively, those carriers carry 80% of all the traffic in the US. Where I think you're going to see the consolidation is in the remaining 20%. You might see JetBlue and Alaska get together, or you might see Spirit and Frontier get together, or you might see Allegiant and Hawaiian get together, or any combination of those carriers. I think you might see that consolidation as carriers find scale economy and being bigger and finding that it's harder and harder to be a 2, 3, or 4% share carrier in a business where the big players are 20% kind of carriers. And in good times, like the industry was coming into COVID, you wouldn't see this behavior because all the airlines were making money and everyone was expensive and it wasn't their priority to merge. Now that carriers are weaker, the ones who are strongest coming out of it, going back to Charles Darwin, those who change most actively and adapt best, they'll be in the position to potentially push a new wave of consolidation that wouldn't be as big a merger as when United merged with Continental or Delta merged with Northwest, but would take maybe a 3% and a 4% carrier and make them together a 7% carrier. And that would ultimately be more competitive over time. So I think all these things are likely to happen over the next 12 to 24 months as a direct result of COVID. So with that, I know I've talked a lot, I've given you a lot of stats and things, but I hope you have some questions you want to ask and we can go from there.
Yeah, Professor, I guess I'll start with the first question. You mentioned about Southwest Airlines and them being the domestic market, that they're not reducing as many of their flights and their capacity. Do you think in the long run that they might like overshadow a big airline like Delta in profitability? Like, do you think this might be a long run sustainable competitive advantage for smaller airlines?
You know, I think it's possible. Within the domestic US, they're already bigger than Delta, American, or United in terms of the business travelers they carry. And what they're doing is they have a little lower cost structure. They have a very strong balance sheet with a lot of cash. And they're saying we can use this time to expand when the bigger carriers or the carriers roughly our size, but that have all these wide bodies and more expensive infrastructure around them, while they're struggling a bit, we can sort of make hay. Let me say something that's going to be kind of funny or strange. You think I might bring this up, but one of my hobbies is I like to play board games. And in the 1990s, a board game came out called Air Baron, and it was a game about the airline industry. And the reason I'm bringing that up is one interesting thing about that game is each round that you play, every person's running an airline. You have to decide for that round whether you're going to be in a price war or not. And if you're not in a price war, you can make money in this game. If you're in a price war, you can't make any money, but it makes it easier to buy other airlines and to take over facilities in big airports, and it makes it easier to expand. So you have to decide, am I going to be aggressive, willing to not make any money right now, but be aggressive and grow my airline? Or am I going to hunker down and keep my capacity under control and make cash? And in that game, it's eerie how similar that is to what's going on in the airlines right now, even though that game was made almost 30 years ago or 20 years ago now. But that's exactly what Southwest is doing. Southwest has said, we've got a lot of cash. We've got lower costs than our bigger competitors. We can live for a long time without making money for a while. Here's the time for us to go get bigger in New York, bigger in Chicago, bigger in California, bigger in Texas, bigger in Florida, where all the people live. And that's what they're doing.
All right. We got a couple more in the comments here for you.
Great.
First one from Indri. What effects has the pandemic had on the food service side of the flying experience? Are food orders for flights down, and have companies changed their activities on that side?
That's a fantastic question. And I don't think you're going to like my answer, but it's an honest answer. I think there's less food service on airlines today. Airlines are using COVID as to why they can't serve food. The airlines that are serving are doing it in sort of hermetically sealed bags, and you take the bag or you don't. The bag has stuff in it, and maybe you like it all or you like one thing in it, but you take the whole thing or you take none of it. You can't say, I just want that. The airlines that are giving people food, that's what they're doing. But I actually think airlines lose money with food on board the airplane, right? They know people like getting fed, especially on longer flights. It's necessary. On shorter flights, it's not as necessary for people to have to eat on board, but the airlines lose money carrying things. And I think what the industry is going to do is going to use COVID to say we can rethink what our onboard product is, and we forever won't have to give as much food as we used to, because we can rationalize it in terms of COVID right now, and then we just will never bring it back and we'll save money over time. I think that's the way airlines are thinking about food right now. Food is also one of the reasons that long haul travel is going to take longer to come back, because now people have to think, well, I'm going to have to eat on board. Does that present another risk? Because who knows who made that food, who handled it before it got on the plane, right? It adds all kinds of risk in people's minds. That's another reason that long haul travel has a little longer time frame before people are comfortable with it.
Mm. It's funny you mentioned they're hermetically sealed. It's not just airlines that have to do that. If we want to host events on campus, we can't order pizza or get Chinese food like we used to. Everything also has to be hermetically sealed. So,
oh, very interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, that's just it. I mean, you don't want to be paranoid, but again, you don't know who prepared the food. You don't know who made the pizza, right? You just don't know that stuff, right? So if you want to be really safe, you don't do that stuff.
Yeah. Oh, here's a good question from Connor. Can you talk a bit more about the implications of the stimulus that airlines received?
Absolutely. And if that's the Connor I know, hello, Connor. If it's not, hello anyway. But the stimulus, let's talk about what the stimulus was first, and so we're clear about what we're talking about. When the CARES Act, as it's called, was first put in place a couple of months ago, it had three things that were specifically for airlines. There was a $25 billion grant to airlines that was to keep employment up. And the idea was it's a pass-through that when the airlines pay their pilots or their flight attendants or their mechanics, they send Steve Mnuchin an expense report that this is how much we paid, and Steve Mnuchin sends them a check for that amount of money. And the idea was, I said earlier that the economy is not going to fully recover until the airlines recover. The administration believes that right now. And so their view was, rather than have airlines lay off a lot of people, we're better off keeping the people there. Pilots can stay current, meaning they won't have to be retrained when they come back. Mechanics can stay fixing airplanes and stay current in their job. And so the idea is keep the car idling in the garage rather than put it up on blocks, so that when the economy is ready to come back, the airlines can put flights back in place really quickly. And that was the idea of the grant. But that, in a sense, it helped airlines, but in a sense it didn't. I mean, because all they were doing is just keeping people employed who weren't flying airplanes. There was a second $25 billion piece of the CARES Act that was a loan. And for that loan, the government gets paid back with certain interest, and they get other benefits. And some airlines applied for and took that loan. Some airlines didn't. So it really depended on whether the airline could get their liquidity from the private market, and they compared what the government could offer to that. Everybody took their piece of the first $25 billion. Not everybody took their opportunity of the second $25 billion. The last piece of CARES Act is something that didn't get any press at all. But airline tickets, when they're sold in the US, have a 7.5% excise tax applied to them. That tax, which came about in the 1950s, actually, it still exists, is a 7.5% tax. So if you buy a $100 ticket from an airline, $7.50 of that ticket is paid to the federal government as an excise tax. And what the government did is they suspended the collection of that tax for a period of time, because they said airlines need to keep as much cash as they can. They have to stay liquid in this time. So for the few tickets they're selling, let them keep 100% of that revenue. Don't make them send 7.5% to us. So those were the three things about the CARES Act. All three of those things helped the industry. But the pass-through money for employees ends the end of this month. And airlines have already put out notices of who they're going to lay off at the beginning of October when this money goes away. The question is, will Congress act to extend that rather than have literally tens of thousands of airline employees laid off weeks before an election, right? it seems to me there are people who are not going to want to let that happen. Maybe others who do want that to happen, right? Based on what they want to see happen in the election. But there's a lot of political jammering going on right now about whether to extend the employee pass-through piece of it. The loan program is done. Nobody's talking about doing more of that. The excise tax suspension is in place now, and it'll come back at some point, probably next year. So it really comes down to whether or not there's going to be more money to keep employees who aren't working employed at their airline rather than go on to unemployment insurance. So it's been really good for US airlines. It's been positive for US airlines. Other countries around the world have not been as good to their airlines. If you talk to the airlines in India or Latin America or Europe, they're saying we're getting nothing from our governments, and they've laid off a lot more people. They're not flying as many flights. And in this country, we've decided they're gonna support the industry right now. It's been good for now, but it also, like, if this is gonna take a year or two to recover, I'm not sure it's great public policy to keep supporting private industries this way either. That's my sense. Great
right.
topic though.
Thank you. Okay, looks like we have another one here. Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Transatlantic Postal Service has been suspended to many countries. So are there any procedures in place when it comes to luggage and cargo that's put on a plane? Anything changed in that area?
That's great, actually. There are cargo-only airlines that are still flying to Europe right now, and those carriers have put in significantly more security and safety requirements in terms of sanitizing the pallets before they put them on the plane, sanitization when they land and they get there. And so there's been a lot of cost that's gone into that. The post office sort of suspending mail, I know, is big and a big issue in voting. There are US citizens living abroad. There was a big article in the Washington Post this weekend. Some of you maybe saw that. There are US citizens living abroad who are wondering, are we going to be able to get our votes in? Are we going to be able to, they vote absentee, are we going to have a process to be able to send them? I think using the cargo carriers that are already flying, they will probably make some arrangements specifically for the voters. In terms of baggage for people right now, there's more screening that goes into your bag. It takes you longer if you're going to take an international flight out of the US that is still operating and you have the right to go and the country's going to let you in, all right, then you still have to get there early enough that your bag can go through more screening and through some more sanitation. I do work for an airline in India. I can't go to India right now, not because there aren't flights. There are flights I could take that would get me to India from Washington, but the country still isn't letting US citizens into the country right now. So I can't go. So all my work with India is through Zoom right now, right? And but when I can go again, I will go, and I'm expecting that any bags I take are going to go through a lot more processing than they normally would have.
Pivoting back to the stimulus, you got me thinking, how big is like the political pull like of the airlines maybe relative just to some other big industries? Because we know, like, obviously they were badly affected, which is a reason why they got a bailout, but how much does the political ties of the airlines that already exist have anything to do with that, you think?
It's a great question. They're actually highly politically leveraged. The airline industry is one of a few industries in the United States that is still heavily unionized. So pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, a lot of airport workers in the United States airline industry are represented by collectively bargained trade unions. And those unions have a strong pull in DC. And both Donald Trump wants to be seen as the candidate for the worker, and Joe Biden wants to be seen as the candidate for the unions, right? So both recognize that the unions that support lots of employees in the United States are going to end up making sort of their pitches as to why you should vote for one candidate or another. So because of that, because largely of the union representation in the industry, they actually have quite a bit of leverage in Washington. And they have a lot of access to legislators. They've got fairly strong lobby power within Washington that absolutely helped them get money in the CARES Act, but it also keeps the airlines top of mind. there's another reality, which is just, it's crazy. Everyone who works in Congress and every senator, unless they're the senator or congressman from Maryland or right, they fly home. And so for them, having flights to be able to get home and get to their district is really, really important. So it's important for them that the airlines don't just shut down and that there are employees who are trained and can fly those flights. And so that's not really politics in a sense, but it gets down to personal interest. I want to get home, so I'm going to make sure American Airlines, who flies to my hometown, doesn't go under, right? So you see that stuff, and that's sort of a second level politics that happens in this industry.
All right. Well, I think that's all the questions we got. Thank you for answering those in great depth. I'm sure.
Well, I hope that the people who signed in here, I hope you found this interesting. Airlines are an interesting topic. They have big policy issues, big economic issues. Like I said in one of the slides, they drive a lot of economic activity around the world. So if you haven't taken my class, I hope you'll consider it. If you have, I hope you'll promote it to others. Right? So I'll make that
not to advertise.
Yeah, that's right. But thank you very much. And I have a George Mason email. My name is Ben Baldanza, so it's B Baldanz because it's only a certain number of things. BBALDANZ @gmu.edu. You can find me on the faculty site if you don't want to remember that name too. And if any of you have any questions, or if I can ever help anyone with any airline related issues or things, don't hesitate to contact me.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us.
Well, thank you, James. I was honored to be a guest for the Economic Society. I think what you guys are doing is great. And I hope the sessions the rest of the semester go really well.
Thank you. We appreciate it. All right, everyone. We'll keep you updated on our next event. We'll probably do something next week. But thank you very much.